name is Don Corleone, and today we're going to learn how to defend against turn bets. So, what topics are we going to learn about? We're going to learn about how to be fearless on the turn. There's a lot of spots where whenever we face heat and we have a marginal hand, it's going to be very uncomfortable. And hopefully, by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to identify the qualities of your marginal hand / bluff catcher and be able to be more confident that you're not making a mistake by either defending or folding, and therefore you won't be afraid of facing such aggression. We'll learn about how to be an effective bluff catcher in every situation. So this presentation is not going to go into specifics about how to build a range exactly in a bottom versus big blind, double barrel, or delay c-bet, or one of these spots. It's not about super specifics. It's more so about an underlying set of rules, you could say, that will help you estimate something relatively close to a decent defense on every spot. And then, of course, if you know more about the specific spots, that's going to be better. But it's even more important to have a good estimation in general. We're also going to talk about how to respond with aggression. So how to raise with value, with bluffs, common mistakes that you're probably making, common mistakes that probably your opponents are making when it comes to this aggression. And you will see how to take advantage from those, why certain things that are believed to be good by a lot of players are in fact really punishable. So let's talk about the calling threshold. It exists between your opponent's value and bluffs. Okay, it's pretty obvious. Anything that exists between your opponent's value and bluffs is going to be considered a bluff catcher. Even on the turn, you could say that they are bluff catchers. And so you're going to have to call some of those and fold some of those. It will never be the case where anything that is below your opponent's value just all has to fold or all has to call, right? That doesn't, or anything that beats your opponent's bluffs, all has to call. That never exists in poker, because if that existed, then your opponent would not be incentivized either to bet thin for value or to bluff, right? And our bluff catchers are essentially making our opponent's bluffs indifferent, and also our opponent's thin value hands to some extent. We're also trying to make them indifferent. Okay, so there's going to be certain hands within these thresholds that we're going to call, and there's going to be certain hands within these thresholds that we're going to fold. It's never going to be the case that we have to call all or none of them. Exists within your range. This seems like what does this mean? Like, well, obviously, if I have a hand in my hand, then it exists within my range too. This is kind of like a silly point. Well, it's a silly point, but a lot of people don't really understand. For example, let's say you have in a certain spot fourth pair, right, or ace high or something like that, and they'll be like, I don't really need to defend fourth pair, or ace high is very low rank hand, right? It's I might be able to have like a second pair or a third pair. But maybe if you think about it more closely, if you think about it for a second, you realize, oh, I would never have second pair in this line. I would never have third pair in this line. In reality, in this line, maybe my only bluff catchers are ace highs, right? And so if I'm saying that within the thresholds of hands between your opponent's value and bluffs, some have to call and some have to fold, and then you think about your range and it's like, okay, I just mostly have ace high, right? And then some ace high is going to have to call, and maybe some ace high needs to fold, right? So defending in a quote-unquote GTO way needs some thought about what our range consists of. It favors extra equity. This is pretty obvious, right? If you have a fourth pair with a flush draw or with a straight draw, it might be better to defend, generally speaking, than a second pair without a flush draw. Not always, but in the most common scenarios, that's true. And it favors good blocker effects. Again, pretty obvious. I would say this is less important than extra equity on the turn, far less important, but it is somewhat important. For example, let's say you can have a second pair, right? And maybe a second pair with a low kicker might unblock your opponent's bluffs, whereas a second pair with a high kicker might block your opponent's bluffs. And therefore, it ends up being something like, having the pair with a lower kicker is better to defend than the pair with the higher kicker. Again, not always. It depends on what your opponent's value range is, what your opponent's bluff range is, etc. But it's something to keep in mind for sure. And depends heavily on board impact. Okay? Another thing that people miss a lot of the time is that if you have very, very general heuristics, like for example, I'm going to defend second pair or better, right? Or I'm going to defend like very, very general heuristics, like, okay, whereas at second barrel, that's not an overbet. I'm just going to defend second pair or better, something like that, right? And you look at some boards and that happens to be close to okay, right? There are certain positions. But what if the board is 3 straight, double flush draw, right? Like a very high impact board. Well, if you start calling a second pair with no extra equity, maybe you're calling way too much, because now you're calling the pairs with a flush draw, you're calling the pairs with a straight draw, right? Like you're defending a insanely high amount. Whereas on a board, like we're going to look at a board like 6-6 deuce jack rainbow, right? Very, very disconnected board. Well, if you don't defend with something fairly dry and weak, quote unquote, you're not going to have anything else to defend with, because you're not going to have things with a flush draw, things with a straight draw that often, right? So again, it depends a lot on the impact of the board. We're going to look at it on GTO Wizard. Very low impact board, rainbow, not many straight draws, gaps in our range in the Jack X and good Ace X region. Okay, very, very important. When we defend, we need to take into account that there's certain sections of hands that we don't have in our range that often. Of course, we're going to have some Jack X, like King Jack with the back of the flush draw, or King Jack in general, and some Jack X with the back of the flush draw, but not that much. And good Ace X region we're missing because, of course, we don't have Ace King or Ace Queen in range that often. So we go back to this board. We see we face a quarter pot bet. We defend. Notice that we're folding some Jack X, right? Jack 3. We have some gaps in this, like Jack X without a back of a flush draw. These Jack is right here, so we're missing some Jack X, and we're of course missing hands like Ace Queen, Ace King. By the time we get to the turn and we face a 2/3 bet, we are missing those hands. And so third pair, 2, is not a bluff catcher, because our opponent, so this is the thing, because we're missing so much Ace King, Ace Queen in our range, our opponent can actually straight up value bet with Ace King, right? Bottom versus big blind. If this was an earlier position, maybe not so much. But bottom versus big blind, Ace King here is strong enough to value bet again on the turn on such a dry board where we are missing a lot of key hands, right? Like a lot of Jack X or Ace King. So Ace King value betting, even Ace Queen to some extent. And that makes it so that any pair, it's not really a bluff catcher. It's just a standard defense, pure call, right? So our bluff catchers actually range from Ace X to strong King X, right? This is the region of hands that exists within our opponent's, or between our opponent's value and bluffs. And so what Ace X are we going to call? Well, apparently, there's not a very clear preference, right? There's some blockers that are preferred to some other blockers, but overall, it's pretty wishy-washy, right? Apparently, the suit, and this, as I will illustrate right now, makes a lot of sense to not want to have the spade as much, right? Because our opponent, when they bluff the turn, the way they're going to construct their bluffing range is they're going to bluff more when they don't block, right? They bluff when they don't block backdoor flush draw. They don't bluff backdoor flush draw, they're going to bluff more. That means they're going to bluff more on the turn with a spade. That means when we have a bluff catcher, we would rather have the flop backdoor flush draw blocker than not. It's a very convoluted effect, but it makes a little bit of sense if you want to kind of remember that. Not that important, I would say, but, you know, again, we see here, instead of spades, although with some hands, it seems to not really matter that much. But the main point is that King Queen, because of the extra equity being higher than these Ace X, is just a straight up a better defend, okay? Higher EV. So that's something to keep in mind. That's how you pick bluff catchers, not based on rank, or not even mainly based on blockers on the turn at this point, more so based on extra equity. Now, what happens if we change the impact of the board, right? Let's make it a flush draw board. That's going to change things. That's going to increase the impact of the board. And as such, we're going to have a lower or as higher absolute hand strength threshold for defending. So now we see that king queen is not a pure call and it doesn't yield any EV. Before it had some EV, it had like 0.38. Now it's basically breaking even, right? Now the ace-x down here are defending way less. Why? Well, now we have ace-x of hearts, king-x of hearts, queen-x of hearts, right? Now we have a lot of other hands that we can defend other than these absolute hand strength hands. And this is still relatively a low impact board. If we had the jack on the flop instead, that would change things a lot. Because if we call the flop when the jack is on flop, now jack X is fairly present in our range. We have jack X a lot. And therefore now our opponent is certainly not going to be value betting as thinly as before, right? Now our opponent is not like pure betting ace, king, no draw, because our range has a lot of jack X. In fact, it's probably even, let's see how much jack X, 21% of our range is jack X. Okay? And now our defense is even more selective in this way. And even still, this is quite a low impact board, right? What about if we do this? Let's just go to the extreme. Let's make it a very, very high impact situation. And let's just make it a double flush draw with a bunch of straights and this type of stuff. Then we'll see the difference. First of all, let's look at what our opponent's value is now. So now our opponent is certainly not betting ace king for value, right? That would, if he bets ace king, it's mainly just a bluff, right? And our value, I would say, comes to maybe nines or something like this could be considered value. And after that, it's more so just a merge, some type of merge, maybe a good eight with a flush draw. It's kind of value, right? So what's going to be our defense range? As we can see, we said that about nines is the bottom of the value. Well, something from second pair down to low pair is going to be a region of bluff catchers. And as we can see, if we have a third pair or a fourth pair without any extra equity, we just straight up fold right away. Why? Well, because we have a lot of other hands that are better to call. And of course, if we had ace high here, it would be ridiculous to call with no extra equity, right? Like some ace queen, right? It loses a lot of money. Same for, the king queen. It would be completely ridiculous, right? Now, these do not beat all bluffs by any means. We're calling, though, with flush draws, a6 with the flush draw, okay? So it is very important to look at the overall impact of the board in both ranges and understand that when it's very, very low, it's likely to be unintuitive how weak of a hand we need to defend. And when the impact is very, very high, it might be the opposite, where it's kind of unintuitive to be able to fold something like an ace-8 here. It's not that intuitive. So be careful with how impactful the board is on both ranges. So what are the conclusions of our little experiment? Threshold depends on texture. Okay, you can't make a broad statement that applies everywhere, like I'm going to call second pair plus, or I'm going to call third pair when I have extra equity. It just depends on the board. If it's a very, very, very dry board, you might have to defend some pretty weak hands like king, queen, as we saw before, just because our opponent can value bet so thinly on a board like that, where we don't have a lot of strong hands. Think about your available hands, right? If you can't have a lot of top pair in range, then you're going to have to defend more second pair. If you can have a bunch of top pairs, then you might have to defend less second pairs. And compare based on characteristics other than rank. Okay, rank is not completely useless. Okay, rank has some merit because higher ranked bluff catchers generally have higher equity against air, right? And they generally have better blockers, right? If you have a second pair, you're going to usually be blocking more two pairs than if you have a bottom pair. So rank is not completely irrelevant. It is, but extra equity is going to be much more important. Okay, so let's go to something a little bit more juicy. Raising the turn. Okay, depends on SPR. So a lot of mistakes that people make have to do with not understanding how the range has to be constructed depending on SPR. When the SPR is very low and your raises are all in, your raises are actually going to be a little bit more mergy for equity denial, and your calls might actually be more polarized because when you have the nuts, you might not want to shove the turn right away. Same for bluffs, right? If the SPR is such that if you raise and you get re-raised, you need to fold, then you're going to choose different draws than if the SPR is such that if you raise and you get raised, you can call still, right? Things like those matter a lot. It's composed of more than value and draws, okay? This is the main mistake that people make. People basically make raising ranges on the turn that are essentially composed of value and draws, okay? And this is, as you will see, extremely exploitable. Not just like, oh, I mean, who cares? I mean, it's a okay enough simplification, right? Just value and draw. No, it's really, really, really easy to take advantage of this thought process. And of course, the more value, the wider range. So things, for example, like if our opponent bets smaller, we raise more. Why do we raise more when he bets smaller? Because we can raise thinner for value, right? He represents a weaker range. We can raise thinner for value, and therefore we can raise more with bluffs too, right? And also depends on the texture. If there's a certain texture where we have no value whatsoever, then we have no raises whatsoever. Outs depend on texture. Okay? Same as this impact for calling thresholds. On a really, really dry board, there might be raises with like 1 over card, 2 over cards, right? Just because those are good enough outs on like a really dry rainbow, paired turn, this type of stuff. Whereas on a double flush or turn, certainly those hands just need to fold. This other board. So we're blind versus blind, single raise spot. We face a block bet on flop, we call, and we face a pot turn bet. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is let's look at the value and bluff thresholds. Top pair is about the value threshold, and then bluffs, anything from a low pair with a flush draw, ace highs with a flush draw, with straight draws, etc., etc. Okay, we face that pot bet, and let's look at the composition of our raises. So of course we have the value in this case, 2 pair plus, not even all 2 pair. And why does the value start at 2 pair? Well, because our opponent's value starts at top pair. We can't raise with king 7 for value. I mean, it might not even be a huge mistake to raise the turn with king 7 in some cases, but it wouldn't be properly called value, right? Because our opponent's value starts around there. And when we raise for value, we want to get called by worse, right? So 2 pair, actually strong 2 pair is value. And let's look at the bluff. So we're going to have some draws like, let's look at actual air. So combo draws, okay? We're raising with queen, jack of diamonds, okay? And what are the reasons for raising with queen, jack of diamonds, but not with jack, 9 of diamonds, but not with these? Okay, it's a very important reason, actually. It's because, first of all, we are folding out hands that dominate us, believe it or not. And also, we are realizing our equity just fine, okay? If we raise this hand, we're folding out, not flush draws, okay? Because our opponent is out of position, really big pot, low implieds, and so he needs to fold a lot of these. So it gets the effect of folding out hands that dominate us, and it also gets the effect of realizing our equity, okay? If we get shoved on here, king, queen calls just fine. So we end up realizing our equity. And actually, the call is decent EV. It's not even that low EV, right? But if we have a worse combo draw, like for example, jack 9 of diamonds, we would probably have to fold to the shove, right? Or at least it would be like super, super, super low EV, right? And so we would be losing a lot of our EV, therefore not properly realizing our equity, okay? So the reason we're able to raise queen, jack of diamonds is not just because we have tons of equity, because we're drawing to the nuts. I mean, that's cool. It's also because we are actually able to withstand a 3-bet push on the turn, and we don't lose a lot of EV that way. So other types of hands, flush draws, okay? So let's look at flush draws. As you notice, not flush draws are not raising at all. Why? Well, if you raise with a not flush draw here, you're actually not going to realize your equity very well because you're going to get shoved on and you're going to be in a problem, and you're going to fold out all of these hands from your opponent. If he has one of these flush draws, you're going to fold them out. You're actually folding out hands that you dominate, right? So you would rather raise, in this case, as you can see, with these low flush draws. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Raise with a low flush draw get folds from a higher flush draw. Therefore, when you hit a flush on the river, you actually have pretty good EV after raising because your opponent doesn't have a lot of better flushes. Whereas if you call and the flush comes, your opponent might actually have higher amount of flushes. Okay, so low flushes are raising to fold out all of these flush draws. High flush draws are just calling. Okay, so realizing our equity and folding out hands that dominate us, and of course, not folding out hands that we dominate. Okay, if we go to open-enders, as you can see, we prefer the hearts over other suits. Now, this, again, is a very minor point. I don't want you to get too obsessed about this. But the heart, if we think about it, our opponent is going to bluff the turn with specifically mostly diamonds. But the suit that he really, really doesn't want to bluff on the turn is a heart. Right? That's the suit that he really doesn't want to bluff on the turn. And so our heart hands unblock folds, right? Our opponent's not gonna have a lot of hands with hearts that fold to the raise. Not a huge point, but just so you understand that dynamic. Now let's go to no draw. Well, if we go to ace high, no made hand, no draw, of course we're not gonna raise anything. We just fold. And so far, I would say the things we've looked at, yes, you might be missing the exact type of flush draw that you raise. Some people raise too much with a strong flush draw and not enough with a weak flush draw. Things like these. But so far, it's not something that escapes most people understanding. But the next portion of the range, I would say, is what leads to more mistakes. Okay, so if we look at second pair through fourth pair, okay, so not a top pair, bluff catchers, okay, and we look at non-draw, okay, we see that we are raising 3.1% with these hands. Not a lot, right? You might say, I mean, does it matter, right? It's just not that much, right? It's a very low frequency. This low frequency, as we will see, is actually quite important. Okay, it's quite important. And what we see is we're doing it with a6 with random suits, 10-4 of hearts, 5 deuce, random suits, ace5, a6. So there's almost no pattern. I mean, there is a little bit of a pattern. Like maybe we prefer to having hearts than other suits. Maybe we prefer having an overcard to the board rather than a no overcard, but then you also see the counter example, like 5 deuce, which would be more of an unblocker type of kicker, right? 10 deuce, 10-4 of hearts, more of an unblocker type of kicker. I don't want you to try to remember exactly these exact combos because I don't think it's important. And, if you change a small characteristic in the solver, it might actually show you a completely different combo raising. But it is important to have some of these combos, some of these very low equity hands. Okay, now if you look at it, you will notice that these low equity raises still exist within our defense range, right? We're not raising some random hand that we wouldn't call. We're not raising with 9-5, right? We just fold 9-5. We just fold 8-5, right? The hands that we're raising as a bluff, even though they have a low equity, they still exist within the relatively profitable defense, okay? So we're going to choose pairs that are relatively okay to defend on the turn, right? We're also going to choose pairs that relatively unblock our opponent's folds. And if we can have an overcard, well, that's even better. But you might say, again, 3%, who cares? Okay, let's see what happens if we remove that part of the range. So let's go to node lock. Let's go to that part of the strategy. So we would go from low pair to second pair, no draw, and let's just force all these hands to just call. Let's just do call, and let's do call and fold 50% here. We'll make it a little bit closer. So we just remove these few pairs that seem like almost solver error. Like, why would you care about a 3% thing that is low frequency in the first place? Okay, let's see why. So let's no lock this and let's see what the response that our opponent could have against our turn raise is. Okay, this doesn't seem like a very normal response, right? Our opponent should, in theory, defend with a range closer to this, where he has some calls, he has some 3-bets, he has some folds. But if we remove those 3% of hands that seem like they don't matter, Suddenly, our opponent is just folding 90% of hands and only defending by 3-betting all in. Wow. Suddenly, we realize that those 3% of hands do matter a lot. Now, what if you say, okay, but this is a bit of a misrepresentation because my node lock has actually reduced the amount of bluffs overall in the range, right? So it's not so much about me removing those 3% of pair hands. It's more so the fact that I'm just removing bluffs. And if I remove bluffs, my opponent is, of course, not going to call ever, right? Okay, let's follow that hypothesis. If that was the case, if the problem is not so much the range construction, but the fact that I've removed bluffs, then let's just add other types of bluffs, okay? Let's go to the node lock. Let's go to add raises. And let's just go to hands like no main hand, combo draw, okay? So let's raise with the combo draw. Let's just raise with more combo draws, right? Let's just raise with more flush draws like this. Let's just raise with them, okay? Now we might actually be over bluffing at this point, right? Let's just raise with a few more straight draws, right? Okay, now we may even be over bluffing rather than under bluffing, right? What's gonna happen now? We are probably way over bluffing. So if we're over bluffing now, our opponent should start calling us, right? No, wrong. If we start adding more draws, the only thing that happens is, yes, we're over bluffing. Yes, our opponent starts not really folding much, but he just doesn't call. He's just 3-bet. He just all in 3-betting with every single hand not every single hand, but with the vast majority of hands that continue, okay? And why is this wrong? Well, why would you be raising with a flush draw if you're going to get shoved on 60% of the time, right? Suddenly, it doesn't make sense, and actually, these raises now are probably losing tons of EV, right? Raising with 9-3 of diamonds against this strategy loses 20 big blinds in EV because this guy is exploiting us by just 3-betting, okay? So this is the problem of removing the low equity hands from our range. Even if we try to replace them with draws, the draws are not a good replacement for actual bluffs, right? And so we see that we actually need those hands in range, even though they're low frequency, in order to get calls. Now, you might say, okay, my opponents are not this smart, right? Like, why should I care if they could exploit us by 3-bet jamming king 7? Just like no one's going to do that. Or king 8, no one's going to do that. Well, true, potentially, depending on who your opponents are, but might be true. But I'm just trying to illustrate you why this equity-driven mentality is wrong, and also what you can do to your opponents, right? If you think your opponents are raising the turn with value and draws, then what should you do? Well, you should start 3-betting a bunch, right? Folding a bunch probably, because they probably are not over bluffing like this. So folding a lot and mainly defending by 3-betting, okay? That would be a really strong exploit against someone who is too equity-driven when it comes to race. So to conclude this part of the lesson, the amount of equity is not the sole or main factor. Okay? As you can see, there's a lot of races with hands that don't really have that much extra equity at all. Low equity hands are needed to get calls. You cannot replace them. You cannot say, okay, this is a solver noise thing. I'm going to just use draws. I mean, maybe your opponents are not good enough to exploit it, but you should be good enough to exploit that in other people. We can punish equity-driven players by re-raising, okay? Basically, if someone is just missing those air hands, we can fold the vast majority of our hands to the raise, and we can respond by only re-raising when we do continue. And if they overbluff, but it's still just draws, we just raise more. So to summarize, always think about the following concepts: the texture, the available hands. What hands do I have in my range? What hands do I not have in my range? Villains, value, and bluffs. And that depends on our range, right? If we are missing a lot of top pair, then our opponent can suddenly value bet a second pair. Raise the turn with the following hand classes: value, draws that realize equity by raising, and also that get folds from hands that dominate us. And very important, the low equity hands. And for everyone else, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one, guys.